Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm hilary.salt.
And I'm Sebastian Moore.
And we are still in the very busy SDP Towers, aren't we, this week? This morning I've been delivering leaflets to the Royal Mail for our candidate in Runcorn.
Yeah, so that is every candidate gets a free leaflet drop from Royal Mail. So the Royal Mail will deliver one leaflet to every household for your candidate. But it's a huge job to get it sorted, and we've been working hard to do that. And we're the first party to have...
They told me, I don't know whether they should tell me this, I don't want to get them into trouble, but they did tell me at Royal Mail that we were the first one they'd done for this election, so we're on the ball. But we are also very keen to continue doing Take Me Home, and we've got, I think it's a more traditional episode this week, Sebastian, where I'm going to talk about markets and technical things, and you want to talk about bike lanes.
Bike lanes, yeah.
Superb. So, shall I let you go first?
Well, it might be worth just saying before we start that it's been a very exciting week politically. It feels huge.
Absolutely.
I mean, we talked about it briefly with Claire Fox in our last episode, which you can watch now. And if anybody would really want to understand this in a bit more detail, because a lot of the stuff I'm seeing at the moment is very wide of the mark. I think people really aren't understanding the tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed. So if you want to understand that in a little bit more detail, go and watch our episode with William Clouston, where he digs into it a little bit more.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. We are, I think, in the middle of a political revolution, aren't we? Which is exciting and disturbing and a little bit scary. But
I'm here for it.
Yeah, interesting times.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And with that in mind, I thought I'll rise to the moment and discuss the important issue of bike lanes.
It is important, isn't it? I pointed out to you, didn't I, that in my local paper there was an article from the vicar at the local church complaining that bike lanes had ruined his church.
Yes. Church numbers dwindling, and the vicar thinks it's down to bike lanes. It might be, or it might be one factor in many. I'm terrified to speak of this.
Because it's polarising.
It might be the most polarising issue there is. I mean, you look at all of the really tough issues to talk about at the moment. Bike lanes seems to really boil people's blood.
Okay.
So the reason I want to talk about it is because where we are in Manchester, they've just undergone some works on Deansgate, which is probably the most famous street in Manchester.
Yeah.
Runs from Deansgate Station all the way up to pretty much Victoria Station. And they've, for the last 6 months or so, have just completely upturned the streets. And there's been a lot of roadworks in order to basically put in some bike lanes. Now, this project cost, supposedly, well, I looked at the figures, it said between £2 and £4 million, and then the BBC quoted as £14 million. And the idea was to make Deansgate more bicycle friendly. So, firstly, it's worth saying, I approve of making places bicycle friendly. That's the bit that's going to get me in trouble throughout this conversation.
Yeah.
However, I also have my concerns. So, this is a really contentious issue nowadays, partly because people would consider it a war on the motorists. So, with Deansgate as an example, they've basically made it one way. So, they've taken this quite a wide road, really, where there was on-street parking, 2 lanes, and they've turned it into 2 bicycle lanes and a one-way road. Now, I actually think there was plenty of room to have 2 road lanes as well as a bike lane. I don't see why they've had to do that, but I think it's part of this issue where it's carrot and stick. And so the stick being that they're making it more difficult for cars to get into the city centre because they're trying to encourage less car usage and more usage on public transport and bicycles. So this is really politically unpopular, though. As you might know, there were a lot of protests for things like the ULEZ, the ultra low emissions zone, and what's called CAS in
Manchester,
Greater Manchester. So this was Andy Burnham wanted to bring in this clean air zone, and they put up the cameras, quite a big expense, and there was so much opposition that they decided not to go ahead with it. And I was actually at an event where it was like an Ask the Mayor Anything sort of event, where somebody actually asked him about the clean air zone and what are you going to do with the cameras, and he said, we're going to consult people and we want to get them, most of the money out of them. So he's thinking about using them for the police to use them as CCTV basically, and that's a consultation that's going on at the moment. Anyway, so it's a very tricky thing politically, and it really divides people. Now, I thought I'd just I want to focus mostly on bicycles because that's kind of the segment, but inevitably we'll have to talk about cars a little bit as well. So, firstly, usage of bicycles. So, do you know what percentage of trips are made by bike in the UK, roughly?
Percentage by mileage, you'd think would be quite small, so maybe
This is
5.
No, it's the percentage of trips. So how much out of all of the trips that are made, what percentage are by bike?
11?
2.8.
Oh, I went the wrong direction there.
And I'm part of that 2.8.
Well done. As am I.
As are you, yeah.
Just as an aside, I do think that one of the real problems when this is talked about politically is people talk about motorists, cyclists, pedestrians. And there's days when I'm all of those things.
Exactly, yes.
And it's really wrong to divide the population up as if they're in one of those groups and not the others.
Exactly, and I think you've just touched upon a real common failing of the way we discuss these things in our media and publicly, is that we often put people into boxes and we don't realise that you can actually be in any number of those boxes, not just on different days, but within the same trip.
Absolutely.
Some people cycle to the tram stop and lock their bike up and then take the tram. Some people cycle to a friend's house and get a lift. So, yes, I think that's a really good point. What about other countries then? So Netherlands and Belgium are often heralded as cycling nations. What percentage of trips do you think are made on a bike in the Netherlands?
20?
27%. And 41.2% of workers in Belgium cycle to work.
Gosh.
Which is amazing. So I've cycled in both of those countries and they do have an amazing sort of bike infrastructure. So what are some of the arguments then for cycle lanes? Well, one of them is safety. And a lot of the problem that and this is one area where I think car users actually do want bicycles to get out of the way.
Yeah.
Because they're holding up cars at times. So just on road safety, do you know how many fatalities there were on the roads in 2024?
6,000.
1,607.
Oh, wow.
And of those, how many were cyclists?
15%.
Oh, you're making me do percentage now.
Oh, sorry.
83.
Okay. So,
which is
X percent.
X percent, exactly. Less than 10%, isn't it? Okay, and then cars made up 727 of those fatalities. So cyclists don't account for a lot of the road accidents. Now, one reason that might be is because there are few cyclists on the road in the UK compared to these other countries. One
reason might be that motorists are very careful around cyclists.
Of course, yeah. So bike lanes then. There are 3 aspects from what I can tell with bike lanes that are important. The width, the surface, and how they interact with the road and with the pavements.
Yeah.
Now, the width is really important because if you have, for example, like you do on the Curry Mile, which a lot of people around here will know the Curry Mile on Oxford Road, it's very, very narrow. So what happens is if you're cycling along and somebody steps into the cycle lane, which happens every single time, and I say this not as an exaggeration, it's every single trip, usually 3 or 4 times as I cycle along the Curry Mile, somebody will step out in front of you and you have to jump on the brakes because you can't swerve around them. There's no width to it. So it's too narrow. The surface, if you're trying to encourage people to use the bike lanes and not be in the car lanes, it has to be smooth because it's so much more important for cyclists than it is for a road user. And it's not just potholes, it's the actual smoothness of the surface is really important. And so often they're just not done, and this is the same for the Deansgate ones, they're not done smoothly, so you're just bouncing up and down, and it's actually smoother in the road, but you wouldn't seem like that if you're driving.
And you don't want grids.
Don't want?
Grids, that collect the water grids. Because quite often the bike
Drains?
lane... Yeah, but the grid cover that leads to the drain.
I've never heard
The
of
drain
that.
is a thing underneath, the grid is a thing on top.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yes,
you don't want
exactly.
grids,
Yeah.
and you don't want litter.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the issues with there was a massive inverted commas bike lane because it was just a load of cones down Chester Road in Manchester. And I, as a cyclist, never ever used it. It was called a cycle lane. It's one of the things that put in during COVID. But it was so strewn with litter and debris that you couldn't use it as a cycle lane. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what motorists get fed up about. That they're being told, oh, that's a cycle lane, and they know that no cyclist would ever use it. That's very frustrating for motorists.
Yeah, and I think it's why that a lot of the way that our roads are set up now, a lot of that means that it's actually harmful to both cyclists and motorists.
Yeah.
Okay, the third thing then is how they interact with the road, and this is my biggest concern with the Deansgate ones, is that, and this is why I don't think a cyclist has actually made them. A lot of the time what they'll do is when they get to a junction, cycle lanes go off and they act then like pedestrians.
Yeah.
Now, there's a huge difference between a cyclist and a pedestrian in the way that you're using the road and the vehicle, so the bicycle itself. It's very hard to be braking and then start again, right? So you want to keep up as much of that momentum as possible.
Yeah.
And the problem with the way that we design cycle lanes in the UK is that we give the priority to the cars that are turning in, so turning left, let's say, and it requires cyclists to stop and use their own traffic lights.
Yes.
Now, what happens with that, and people will say, that's great because it's getting cyclists away, and they've got to wait just like car users. The problem is the cyclists will then just use the road.
Yeah.
That's what I do, because you're incentivizing them to go into the road.
Yes.
That's what annoys car users. So I think I have a lot of concerns with the way that we do bike lanes, and I think it's annoying car users whilst not actually resolving the issues and encouraging people to cycle. And we should be encouraging people to cycle, in my mind, and this is the thing that will upset a lot of people, because at the end of the day, do we want a city that is populated with cyclists, or do we want a city that's populated with cars? And I know that my answer to that, and in preparation for your protests, I thought I'd print out a quote from a Peter Hitchens article, which I'll put in the show notes. He says, "If you do not love automobiles for what they are, I think you are bound in the end to hate them for what they do. Look at the way they spoil every prospect. A line of garishly coloured cars parked in a beautiful city square wrecks the proportions of the place. Their curious shapes, inhuman and flashy, clash violently with almost every style of architecture except the most brutal concrete modernism. The incessant noise and smell of them, the horrible danger they represent to soft human bodies, the space they take up, are all outrages against peace, beauty and kindness." And I largely agree.
Okay.
Here we go.
Well,
I'm ready for it.
So the smell and the noise obviously goes quite a lot with the electric cars. That objection goes away. And I absolutely agree we need better ways to park cars. One of my real bugbears is cars parked on the pavement. And whenever I see anybody parking on a pavement, this is another thing that I do. I go up to them and say, "Can you not park on the pavement, please?" Right next to my house is an old people's home. And when people park on the pavement there, it means, when people come in with their Zimmer frames or their wheelchairs, they can't get along the pavement. So I absolutely agree that we need better, more appropriate ways to park vehicles. But again, I just don't think we should have a war between cyclists and motorists. I think there's some times when you need the car. I couldn't get my 96-year-old dad to Asda on a bike. Neither could I on my own get the groceries home from Asda on a bike. If Asda don't sponsor us, they're very welcome to, by the way. I think it's horses for courses, isn't it? Horses as well, obviously, should have some horse lanes.
We should.
But I just think this war between different modes of transport is just the wrong way to look at it. But I'm absolutely for encouraging cycling, and just to give Manchester Council its due for a moment, one of the things I think they've done really well is the bus islands. Is that what you call them?
Mm-hmm.
So if you do the big main road through Chorlton, all the bus stops there, the bike lane doesn't go in front of them, because when it does, you're terrified as a cyclist. Well, I am. I know you're a bit more confident as a cyclist, but I'm always terrified that the bus is going to turn into the bus lay-by and knock me over. But they've installed these bike lanes that go round the back of all the bus lanes, which I think is great, because it does mean you're not terrified and you don't have to stop because of the bus pulling in or out. So I think some things like that are really good.
Yeah, that's quite a good system, and I've seen it used in Denmark. What's really important with that is then you cannot have the bus stop on the bus island, which sometimes happens, like on Oxford Road.
Yeah.
Because then people are... The line of sight is blocked, so it becomes really dangerous when people are stepping in and out of the bike lane. So you have to have the bus stop on the pavement side, and then people cross the bike lane when they need to get on their bus.
I see.
And this is where I think we're not learning the lessons from the other countries, and this is what I worry about. I agree with you, we shouldn't be having a war between motorists and cyclists and so on. But I do think it's in the government's... I do think the government should be incentivising certain travel use over other travel use. And that is the one that most benefits society. And I would say cycling more benefits society more than cars. Now, you still have to be able to, like you said, if you need a car, absolutely. And this is where I actually think it needs to be easier to get around in a car than it is. And part of that is reducing the traffic on the roads, right? So when you do actually need your car, you can know that you can use it and get to the place on time.
Yeah, it's interesting. For the past kind of generation, I think we've been saying this will be the last car I ever buy, because we keep having our mind's eye the idea that there'll just be kind of cars that you just rent for the day, or like these little city cars that they have in some towns where you can rent it for an hour or 2 hours. And why would you have a car that sits on your drive all the time? And I think that would be good if we did have that. We had a lot of fewer cars, but you still had the ability to access one whenever you needed one. So,
if there are any complaints, feel
direct
free
them to Sebastian.
Yeah, direct them towards me. But what happens nowadays, I suppose, is they just flood the comments with people shouting. Look forward to it.
Yeah.
Okay, slightly more serious issue, perhaps?
Yes.
Or intellectual issue, let's say.
Well, not more technical, perhaps, rather than intellectual. So what I wanted to talk about as my news item was issues around IPOs, so initial public offerings, when you first take a business to market. But I think given the state of markets at the moment, it would be silly to just talk about that without maybe just spending a little bit of time talking about the free fall on equity markets globally at the moment, which everybody's describing, the BBC especially is describing as being caused entirely by Trump's tariffs. And I do think that the tariffs and the discussion around them and the kind of tit-for-tat nature that we're seeing is really has been something that has tipped stock markets over the edge almost. But I would argue quite strongly that stock markets have been overvalued for a long time, particularly the US market. And actually, what we are seeing is a much wider shift away from the kind of consensus that we've had for the past 5 decades, maybe you might say, where everything is denominated in dollars, the value of the dollar is very high. The US is expected to pick up the pieces, not just in things like defence, but in things like stock markets. So in the past, when things like this happen, you kind of know you're getting to the end when the Fed says so. And the Fed will often, in these circumstances, step in and calm the markets. And interestingly, they don't seem to be doing that. So that's another, I think, example of the fact that America is no longer going to be willing to step in and pick up the pieces all the time, which goes back to that idea we're in a bit of a political revolution at the moment. So I wouldn't think, if Trump got rid of all the tariffs tomorrow, I don't think stock markets would just rebound and everything would be like it was the day before he announced them. I do think we're in a real position where things are changing quite quickly. So I thought it was worth saying that. There's a few ideas floating around, and I don't know how much truth there is to some of these. Some quite reputable people seem to be saying it, but there's this idea of the Mar-a-Lago Accord. Do you know anything about that?
No.
So this is a bit like the Plaza Accord that we had in the 1980s. This is a discussion around how you reduce the value of the dollar. And so the idea that some people have floated is that what a lot of the tariff stuff about is effectively Trump bringing people to the table. Because you probably know that lots of people, but especially China, holds huge amounts of US Treasury stock. So that's debt issued by US government. Now, the US government is paying something like 4.5% interest on that at the moment. And, that is part of what the problem is for the US. It has a lot of debt. It's paying a lot of interest on it to China and to other people as well. Now, there seems to be some idea that Trump wants to bring the Chinese to the table and say, okay, guys, you trade in all that Treasury debt that you've got now, and I'll give you in return a new Treasury debt. It's a 100-year debt, and it pays 1% interest. So what that would do is devalue the dollar. It would reduce the interest overhang that's dragging down the US economy, and it would reset everything. So it would be a way of resetting a lot of those big trade imbalances that we've got. Now, I don't know whether there's any truth to these ideas, but that seems to me quite an interesting way in which you might resolve things, because things aren't resolved until we do address some of those big imbalances. Now, what China could do, presumably, is it could say, oh, do you know what, I don't much like the look of this US Treasury debt anymore, I'm just going to sell it all. Now, what that would do is it would plunge markets into even greater disorder. It would massively increase the yield on US debt, so they have to pay much higher interest rates. Do you remember we did that episode on discount rates, and when the price of bonds goes down, the yield on bonds goes up. So if everybody's flooding the market with US Treasury debt, the price goes down, the yield goes up, so interest rates go massively high in the US and probably everywhere else as well. So there's lots of things here that could happen that could tip things into quite significant disarray quite quickly. But, it kind of feels that if Trump plays it well, this could be a way out of some of these issues.
Okay.
Was that too technical?
I start to get lost at some point. How does this link to IPOs?
It doesn't really. I just felt that if I was going to start talking about the stock market this week, everybody would say, well, does she not know? Things are there's a lot happening on the stock market. So we could move on to that, have a more prosaic discussion around IPOs that I wanted to do, but I felt I had to say a little bit about markets before it.
Okay.
So IPOs.
Yes.
You know what one is?
Initial purchase offering?
Initial public offering.
Public offering.
Yeah, so it's when you first go to market with a stock. So it's quite interesting because recently a lot of people have been floating broadly UK businesses in the US rather than in the UK. So
just explain what that's like. So if you have a business and you decide to float it on the stock market, you choose, are we going to put it on the London Stock Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange?
Yeah.
How does that then work, like with an IPO?
So if you're going to float a company in the UK, you'd have to go through a whole range of compliance and regulatory requirements. Costs something like £500,000 or £1 million to float a business in the UK.
Who are you paying? You're
paying lawyers to look through all your books and make sure there's nothing that anybody doesn't know about. You might need to check all your copyright requirements. You might be looking at your intellectual property. You might be looking at whether there's any liabilities that people don't know about. You need to issue a prospectus that tells everybody everything about your business. So you'd have auditors and people like that crawling all over your books to make sure you're not telling the market lies. So it's a huge amount of work to get a business to market. So, I mean, perhaps if we take a step back, because that's an interesting question. The reason I actually started looking at this was because we started talking about farms and, you know, when a farmer retires, you can't pass the business on. And I made the point that, well, actually, that's exactly the same with any other business. So if you've got a business and you want to sell it, let's say you've got a business that's making £10 million a year profit. If you want to sell that because you want to retire or you want to pass it on to the next generation, or if you die and your family has to pass it on in some way, they will have a big inheritance tax liability and you will need to sell it. And the ways you can do that are you can sell it to a trade buyer, so somebody is like a takeover, somebody takes over your business. And you might, for that, you might get something like 7 or 8 times the annual profit. So you might get 70 million, 80 million for a business making 10 million. Tax to pay on that as well, but you know that's about what you might get for it. Or you could say to perhaps the people who are running it now, you can take it over, but they would need backing, and so they would generally go to somebody like maybe a merchant bank or maybe private equity, somebody like that, to give them the 70 million so they can buy the business. Or you might look to say, well, let's try and float it. And this is, you know, if you do try and float it, it costs a huge amount, but the payback is that you get much more for it. So on the stock exchange, for that same business, rather than get 7 times profit, you might get 14 times profit. So it's a huge difference. And the huge difference is because once it's quoted on a stock exchange, people can buy and sell it. It's liquid. Whereas something that's bought by somebody else can only be bought kind of in one piece. So that's why
it becomes a more valuable asset because it can be sort of chopped up into small pieces and traded.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's why you float. So, you know, that's why you pay the £500,000, £1 million to float. And typically, UK businesses would float in the UK. But there's been lots of examples recently, not just of IPOs actually, but of existing businesses changing their listing to the US. And some of the names you might have heard of are Flutter. That's the organisation that owns quite a lot of the betting, not just shops, but online betting organisations. That's recently moved to the US. In terms of new floats, I think Klarna, do you know the name Klarna? Yeah. So that's the buy now, pay later kind of organisation there. I think going to float in the US.
Just named 2 things which I consider very immoral.
Well, yes, possibly. Well, Arm, what about Arm? They are the chip makers. They make chips.
Okay.
Not fish and chips.
Yeah,
no, the chips for computers and
they're
everything
all
else
right.
like that.
We like chips.
Yeah, okay. So they've also chosen to go to the US instead. So why is that happening? Is the question. And partly I think it is a bit of razzmatazz. So, you know, if you list in America, you get to ring the bell when trading opens and you can have your name splashed over Times Square. And some people have said it's a bit like a marriage, a bit like a big wedding. So there's those kind of things. But also there's quite a lot of discussion, and this is why we needed to have that other conversation earlier, I think, that you get a better price in America, that people value businesses much higher in the US, and especially tech businesses. And when I say tech businesses, that obviously includes people like chip makers, but actually betting is a largely online thing, so that's quite techy as well these days. So there's a lot of argument that actually the reason why people want to list in America is because the American market is valued much higher. And I think that has been true. Whether it's true now after all the corrections that we're seeing, maybe not. But that is a big difference. So if you think about the London Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange came out of those, those coffee shops in the 17th century. So it's been there for a long time. And part of the reason London has really, I would argue, been very successful as a financial centre is partly because of English, the kind of global language, but partly because its time zone is intermediate between the US and China. So there's an overlap between the market being open in the UK and in Hong Kong, for example, and in the UK and the US. So it's at different ends of the day. But
would it not also be that London was the centre for trade worldwide for so long?
Absolutely, yeah. So part of it is historic, but part of it was still there's a real reason it carried on. I think about 20 years ago, the equity market in London was about 11% of the global market. It's down to about 4% now. So
now, just to kind of go back to that, floating a company and deciding whether you put it on the London Stock Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah.
Maybe I have quite an antiquated view of the world, but I just assumed until quite recently that if you had a British company and you wanted to float it, it would go on the London Stock Exchange.
And that would have been the case, 20 years ago, certainly. I don't think anybody would imagine that you would do anything very different. But now it is quite frequent that people will look to list in the US instead.
Even if there's no link to the US?
Yeah. For these reasons, that they think they'll get a higher value. There's certain compliance differences in the US as well. It's sometimes easier to do things like issue shares that don't have the same voting rights as everybody else. In the UK, there's quite strict requirements from the regulators about, people have to have broadly the same shares, and once somebody buys so many shares, they have to make an offer for all the shares. So there's quite a lot of those kind of rules in the UK that don't exist in the US. So there's all those things that might make a US listing look more attractive. On the other hand, and I'm not trying to sell the London Stock Exchange or anything, but I think there are reasons why London is still quite attractive. And one is that to be recognised in America, you have to be really big. Whereas it's a bit smaller market in the UK, and smaller companies can get into what we call the FTSE 250 or the FTSE 100. So that's the top 100 biggest companies by market capitalisation, by the price of their shares times the number of their shares.
And that's a changing list, isn't it?
It is. It changes quite frequently, yeah. But it's easier to get on it in the UK because it includes smaller businesses. And interestingly, once you're in that FTSE 250, we have a lot of market investment in the UK is passive, which means the manager buys all the shares. And so he just looks to track an index. So if he's tracking the 250 index, he will hold all of the 250 shares. So there's a kind of automatic demand for your shares once you're in the 250.
Okay, yeah, I kind of got lost for a second, but it's people buying shares.
Yeah.
Want to buy shares from the FTSE 250 or the FTSE 100.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so you're more likely to do well if you're in that.
Yes.
That list.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there is perhaps a broader spread of investors in the UK. So the investors in the UK, about 40% UK, about 40% American, and about 20% the rest of the world. Whereas in America, 80% of the investors are from the US. Okay. So quite different, more diverse in the UK, perhaps more people that you can appeal to. So there are good reasons still to list in the UK, and I think the London Stock Exchange is trying to kind of mount a bit of a rearguard action to persuade people that it is still worth sticking to a UK listing, and I think we'd want to encourage that.
Very much so. Maybe list it on the LSE and you get to meet the king or something.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, let's come up with some new ideas like that. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Great.
Good. Well, I appreciate that you dumbed it down for me so that I could follow along.
Yep.
I'm sure the listeners were getting upset saying, come on, Sebastian. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're at the moment in the SDP, we're looking at our small and medium-sized enterprise policy, aren't we? And I think what that does is kind of makes us be a bit more. We have to engage with some of these questions a bit more. Like what's a business worth, which perhaps people don't engage with on a day-to-day basis. Actually,
absolutely, and I think for most people aren't sort of familiar with what's going on the stock market.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And I think it would be good for it to be more accessible for people to understand what's actually happening and why it's important for our lives.
Yes.
And I think the stock market being in the news at the moment is interesting because people can engage with that a bit more.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things in America, I didn't say earlier, is that there is a huge swathe of people now who have very big 401k plans.
Yeah.
Do you know what they are? Yes, good. And obviously a lot of those will be invested very highly in equities, and as they see the value of those going down, you'd expect some kind of public reaction or at least debate about stock markets. So that'll be interesting.
The stat I saw, and I might have to cut this if it's wrong, was that 52% of Americans are directly affected by the stock market. So like the actual...
Yeah. Skin in the game, as they say. Yeah. Yes. That wouldn't surprise me. Yeah. So I think that's about everything I want to say. Yes.
Yeah.
Great. So hopefully us going back to more traditional areas, the stock market and cycle lanes.
Bike lanes.
Yeah. Has been a good episode for you. Please, as always, share and recommend and like the show. And we will see you again next week.
Cheers.